She walked into that ring a janitor, but by the time she stepped out, every head had bowed and every phone was lowered. What Margaret Lane did with one punch silenced an entire gym and awakened a lesson none of them saw coming. Have you ever underestimated someone? Drop your thoughts below. This story's just getting started. Stay until the end of the video to understand why sometimes the one most underestimated is the one who makes the entire world bow its head. Margaret Lane had been working the early shift at Horizon Athletics for nearly 2 years, quietly mopping the same floors that high-dollar members jogged across without ever looking down. At 52, she moved with the kind of rhythm that only came from repetition, steady, silent, and unnoticed. The gym was a split world. The front, all polished mirrors and smoothie bars, looked like something from a luxury magazine. The back, where the real fighters trained, smelled of sweat, rubber, and tape, with ropes frayed from years of punishment. Margaret belonged to neither world, not in their eyes. She was the one who pushed the cart, the one whose shoes squeaked when she turned corners, the one with the gray sweatshirt tied around her waist and the faded staff badge clipped to her belt loop. Most people never spoke to her unless they spilled something. They assumed things, that she was tired, invisible, forgettable. And maybe she was used to that. But one Friday morning, as she reached to wipe a smudge of chalk from the corner of the boxing ring, a young man with a puffed-up chest and overconfident grin looked down at her and chuckled, "Hey, janitor, careful. If you step in too far, that mop's gonna need gloves." His name was Kyle Bishop, one of those weekend fighters who talked louder than they punched, 6 amateur wins and a mouthful of something to prove. Laughter echoed behind him. One of the other trainers added, "Maybe she's disinfecting the ring before her big debut." Margaret didn't flinch. She finished cleaning the mat, wrung the towel back into her bucket, and rolled the cart toward the next corner. The sound of the wheels creaked through the silence that followed. No one noticed that she didn't respond, because they weren't really watching. Not yet. The teasing started like most teasing does, harmless, tossed around like a worn-out medicine ball, meant more for laughs than injury. Kyle kept it going as the morning crowd began to gather. "Come on," he said, grinning wide as he stretched his shoulders and laced up his gloves. "Give her a round. Let's see what mop duty looks like in the ring." A few of the younger trainees chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they thought they were supposed to. Someone near the heavy bags muttered, $10 says she doesn't last 30 seconds. Another chimed in, "Bet she trips over the mop." The front desk staff joined in too. Brent, the junior coach with too much voice and not enough tact, smirked as he leaned on the ropes. "Let's make it official," he called out. "Kyle versus the janitor, opening bout before lunch." The whiteboard usually reserved for sparring schedules was quickly commandeered. Kyle laughed as he watched the marker squeak out, 11:30, Kyle versus Mop. The room filled with the buzz of pre-show energy, phones were raised, angles were checked. Nobody, not one person, asked Margaret what she thought. She was still wiping down the vinyl edge of the ring, her back to them, her motions calm, unhurried. It wasn't until someone called out, "You got gloves, mop lady?" that she paused. Slowly, she walked over to her cart, knelt beside it, and reached under the folded towels. Her hand came back with a pair of gloves, old, weathered, darkened at the knuckles, the kind you didn't just buy last week. The room went quiet for a half-second, just long enough for the sound of a jump rope in the corner to skip a beat. Margaret stood up, gloves in one hand, and stepped toward the ring. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply waited by the edge, her posture steady, her chin level. Kyle, still grinning, flexed for the phones now recording and shouted, "Let's go, mop girl, give us a show." But something in her stillness made a few people hesitate. She didn't look like someone gearing up for a joke. She looked like someone getting ready for work, the kind of work that didn't require an audience, only purpose. And that, more than the gloves, was the first thing that unsettled the room. Margaret didn't climb into the ring like a challenger. She stepped between the ropes with quiet familiarity, as though she'd done it 1,000 times before, not as a fighter returning, but as someone who had never truly left. She knelt beside her gloves and began wrapping her hands, tight, deliberate, symmetrical. There was no wasted motion, no trembling fingers. She didn't look up, not at Kyle, not at the crowd gathering at the edges of the mat, some standing, some sitting on benches, all holding their breath between chuckles. Kyle was already playing to the crowd, bouncing in place, tossing light jabs into the air, nodding at someone holding up a phone. "Don't blink," he said, laughing. "This'll be over before her shift ends." Brent leaned over the ropes with a smirk and tossed Kyle his mouthguard. "Try not to scuff the floor," he called out. "She just cleaned it." A few more laughs. Margaret finished wrapping her wrists, pulled on the gloves, tugged the straps with firm tugs. Her expression never changed. She walked to the corner and stood still, her hands at her sides, eyes resting not on Kyle's face, but on his torso, calm, observant, like she was listening to his breath instead of his voice. The makeshift bell, an old metal plate hung for sound, was slapped once with a towel-wrapped stick. It rang out through the gym with a hollow clang. Kyle stepped forward, grinning, his stance loose, cocky. He threw a slow jab toward her chest, more of a test than a strike. She slipped it without effort, a single step left. No counter, no reaction. Just quiet, fluid control. "That all you got?" he taunted, jabbing again. Another dodge, this time a backward glide, her feet nearly silent on the mat. From the corner, a low voice, Coach Morris, one of the older trainers, muttered, "That's not just reaction time, that's drilled." A few people had stopped smiling. Margaret didn't move like someone trying not to get hit. She moved like someone who had sparred with men faster and hit harder. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her breathing steady. Kyle circled again, trying a light combo, jab and cross, but she wasn't there when the punches landed. She didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't break rhythm. She was still reading him, and the gym, once full of laughter, was slowly growing quiet. Kyle's grin began to tighten. The crowd, once full of casual jeers and laughter, had grown noticeably more subdued. He wasn't landing anything, not even close. Margaret was always just a fraction of a step away, never flustered, never retreating, simply not there when he struck. Her movement was minimal, efficient, the kind of control that came not from fear but from experience. Still, Kyle wasn't worried, not yet. He bounced on his toes, shook out his arms, and moved in again, this time with more purpose. He feinted left, then threw a quick right aimed toward her ribs. Margaret pivoted smoothly, her back foot gliding as her torso dipped under the punch. Kyle's gloves sliced through air. His feet hit the mat harder now, and the rhythm of the spar shifted, less playful, more intent. Somewhere near the dumbbells, someone whispered, "She's not just dodging. She's studying him." Coach Morris, still watching from the bench by the bags, leaned forward slowly and said under his breath, "That's timing. That's ring awareness." Kyle stepped in again, shoulder forward, throwing a compact three-punch combo, jab, hook, cross, but Margaret slipped them like she was dancing, never off balance, her eyes fixed not on his fists, but on his center line, the rise and fall of his chest, the angle of his hips. And then it happened. He leaned in too far, put a little too much weight on his front foot, and she moved. A pivot on her heel, her right foot slid half an inch, her left knee bent slightly, then she struck. One punch, a short, tight hook delivered low and flat, aimed just beneath the ribcage. The sound wasn't loud, not a smack or slap. It was deeper, a quiet thud that landed and sank. Kyle's eyes widened. His breath caught. His legs buckled at the knees. He dropped, folding in on himself like a man whose body had suddenly remembered something his mind hadn't yet processed. Silence rolled across the gym. No one clapped. No one jeered. A phone beeped once in someone's hand, then went still. Margaret didn't move. She stepped back slightly, lowered her gloves, and waited. Kyle stayed down, one hand against the mat, the other clutched against his side. His face had gone pale. Coach Morris stood and stepped toward the ring, raising a hand to halt anyone from interfering. "Don't touch him yet," he said, voice steady. "She caught him clean." And in that moment, every joke, every smirk, every assumption crumbled beneath the weight of a single, perfectly placed punch. The gym stood frozen, like someone had flipped a switch and drained the noise from the room. Kyle was still on the mat, knees folded under him, arms limp at his sides, his head hung low as he struggled to breathe through shallow, clipped gasps. A few trainees edged toward the ropes but didn't speak. Even Brent, usually full of sound and swagger, had nothing to say as he hovered near the corner, one hand nervously tugging at the edge of the ring. Margaret stood quiet, gloves loose at her sides, no expression on her face, just calm, controlled and still. Then the front door opened with a click, and the wind carried in the weight of a presence far more familiar than any of the voices in the room. Coach Howard Benton, a man in his late 60s with a slow, sure walk and eyes that missed nothing, stepped in with keys still in hand and a half-zipped hoodie slung over one shoulder. His boots echoed once against the polished floor before he stopped just past the welcome mat. His gaze moved past the ring, past the spectators, and locked onto Margaret. He squinted. "Is that Margaret Lane?" he asked, voice not loud but firm, and the entire gym turned toward him. Brent blinked, confused, looking from Howard to the woman still standing in the ring. "Wait, who?" Coach Benton stepped forward, his tone steady. "Margaret Lane. Southpaw, 3-time regional lightweight champion. Ran drills in this building before we had mats that didn't slide and gloves that didn't match." He pointed toward the wall above the old treadmill bay. "Go look at the photo. Middle row. Blue gloves. That's her." One of the younger boxers jogged over, eyes scanning the old framed team photo, the one half covered by a flyer for a weekend cardio boot camp. "Oh my God," he muttered, louder than he meant to. "She's in the picture. That's really her." Whispers followed, rippling through the crowd. Someone near the front desk let out a slow exhale. Brent stepped down from the apron, his shoulders drawn tight. I didn't know," he said. Coach Benton didn't look at him. "You didn't ask," he replied quietly. "You just assumed." Margaret still hadn't spoken. She stepped out of the ring with the same quiet grace she'd stepped in, gloves hanging from one hand, her eyes focused forward. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. Every head turned as she walked past. Every eye followed. And for the first time since she started pushing that cart, everyone in the gym saw her. Margaret didn't speak as she stepped down from the ring, nor did she look at the faces now staring at her with stunned silence and something close to awe. She walked calmly toward her cart, the same one she'd pushed through those halls every morning without notice, and picked up the towel hanging from its side. She untied her gloves with one hand, peeled the tape from her wrists, and placed everything neatly beside the mop handle. There was no fanfare, no glance back. It was just another task, another item to tend to before moving on. Brent stood nearby, still holding the dry erase marker he'd used to write Kyle versus Mop on the board. His hand dropped slowly to his side. He didn't bother erasing it right away. He just stood there, eyes following her as if trying to reconcile what he'd seen with who he thought she was. One of the trainers near the water cooler folded up a flyer that had once advertised, "Weekend Challenge, Who's Brave Enough?" and slid it into the trash. Nobody told him to. The energy in the gym had shifted entirely. Phones that had once been raised high for mockery were now quietly put away. Some videos were deleted, others left unshared. Conversations dropped to hushed murmurs. Even the music, once pumping loud from the corner speaker, had faded into a low background hum. Kyle was sitting up now, breathing easier, still pale but stable, surrounded by two coaches and an assistant holding an ice pack to his ribs. He didn't speak either. Margaret rolled the cart slowly toward the far corner, wheels squeaking like they always did. She picked up a stray protein shake bottle, tossed it into the bin, and sprayed down the bench like she did every morning. But now, every movement she made drew eyes. Not because she sought attention, but because something had cracked in the room, something fundamental. The woman they'd all overlooked had not only earned her place in the ring, she'd owned it. One of the younger boxers, still standing near the gloves rack, shifted uncomfortably and looked down at his hands, like seeing them for the first time. No one laughed. No one bragged. They watched her with quiet understanding, a kind that required no explanation. For the first time, the gym felt still. And Margaret Lane, former champion, quiet cleaner, and now undeniable presence, simply kept going, mop in hand like she always had. The next morning, Horizon Athletics opened at 6 o'clock sharp, just like always. But something in the air felt different, quieter, more deliberate. The music that usually blared from the speakers started at a lower volume, and conversations, typically filled with early morning jokes and casual boasting, were replaced by nods and brief greetings. Someone had cleaned the benches before sitting down. The towel bins were restocked without being asked. A trainee who usually left his wraps strewn across the locker bench had neatly folded them in a corner. Above the cubbies near the back wall, a single sheet of white paper had been taped. No decorations, no signature, just a quote written in block letters with a black marker. She didn't say a word, but we heard her. No one needed to ask who it was about. Margaret didn't return that day, nor the next. Her cart remained tucked into its corner near the supply closet, the mop standing at attention beside it. Gloves hung quietly on a hook near the radiator where she'd left them to dry. But the impression she made, on the mat, and more importantly, on the people, had taken root. Kyle, the loudest voice from the day before, didn't say much anymore. He came in for light cardio, kept his head down, and trained in silence. Brent, once always quick with a joke, had started his mornings wiping down equipment before the first wave of members arrived. The gym didn't talk about her openly. There was no big meeting or apology or tribute. But her presence echoed through small choices, gloves handled more carefully, ring time used with more purpose, and a shift in how the staff looked at the people moving around them. One of the women who had filmed the spar quietly deleted the video from her phone and hadn't mentioned it since. Even Coach Benton said little, but every so often his eyes would rest on the spot where Margaret had stood, and he'd nod, just once, like acknowledging a name no one dared forget. They hadn't expected to be taught something by a woman with a mop, but they were, not through force or anger or bravado, but through presence, patience, and quiet precision. And long after the punch had faded, long after the laughter had died, her silence remained the loudest sound the gym had ever heard.